My name is Lynn Thomas, and I'm the head of the Rare Book and Manuscript Library, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this evening's event. We always open with reading the institutional land acknowledgement. As a land-grant institution, the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign has a responsibility to acknowledge the historical context in which it exists. In order to remind ourselves and our community, we begin this event with the following statement. We are currently on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Mascoutin, Odawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. It is necessary for us to acknowledge these Native nations and for us to work with them as we move forward as an institution. Over the next 150 years, we will be a vibrant community inclusive of all of our differences, with Native peoples at the core of our efforts. As a heads up, tonight's talk will be recorded, so if you want to revisit it for nostalgia purposes, once we've had a chance to caption the talk, it will be posted to the RBML YouTube account. After Dr. Hauser finishes her talk, there will be a Q&A curated by Dr. Kate Coker, and there will also be a book signing, as I hope you all noticed. There is a table out front with copies of Dr. Hauser's books available for sale. So we'll do a signing after that, and we want to thank the folks at the University Bookstore for setting that up for us, and we want to thank everybody from the Spurlock Museum for making it possible to hold the event here. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kate Coker, who's going to introduce our speaker.
Academic tag. Friends, I am so very happy you have joined us this evening, and I am delighted to introduce you to Dr. Emily Hauser. Dr. Hauser first visited the U.S. for a Fulbright scholarship at Harvard and received her PhD in classics at Yale University. She is currently a lecturer in classics and ancient history at the University of Exeter, and is an award-winning author and scholar who has been featured on the BBC and in The Guardian. Speaking frankly, as a scholar and a fangirl, her book, How Women Became Poets, A Gender History of Greek Literature, was both inspirational and foundational to the Sappho exhibit we have at the RBML, and I'm thrilled that we were able to bring her into this event. What she's going to be talking about is about the recovery of women's voices in literature and in the Bronze Age era. And as many of you know, this is part of an ongoing work, not just for Dr. Hauser, but for many others. The recovery of the voices of the marginalized remains challenging and yet incredibly important scholarly work. So I'm just really happy to hear everything that she has to say. So please join me in welcoming Emily to the stage.
Thank you so much, Kate, for that lovely introduction. Thank you so much to the RBML for having me and hosting this talk, as well as to Spurlock and everyone at Illinois who has given me such a wonderfully warm welcome. It is my first time to visiting the state, so it's really lovely to be here and to have such a kind of wonderful audience of you here tonight. So as Kate mentioned, we're going to be talking about finding the female voice in the ancient world. And what I'm hoping to do with you tonight in a sort of fairly quick 45-minute run-through is to think through the different ways in which we might try to recover the women of the ancient world. The essential question that I want to pose to you tonight is, how do we deal with silence? When we're looking at the women of antiquity, we are looking at an experience, a corpus, that by and large has vanished from the tradition. And just to give you a little bit of a sense of the scale of what we're looking at in terms of women's experiences in antiquity, we have the names of over 3,200 male writers of Greek literature. We have the names of 100 women. And of those, 50 wrote poetry, and of those, 12 survive. So this is just giving you a sense of what we know and what survives, the kind of work that needs to be done. Now, in the past, the response to this tended to be, well, first of all, women weren't an object of study, and they really didn't start becoming an object of study till about the 1970s in my discipline, which is extraordinary. But the second was that silence was an absence and therefore an excuse not to look further. And what I want to ask tonight is, how can we turn silence from an excuse into an invitation? An invitation to be more complex in our methodologies, to be more rigorous in the kinds of questions we ask, as well as, I think, to be exciting in the kinds of interdisciplinary tools that we use. So what I'm going to run you through is essentially some of the different tools that I, as a scholar, also as an author, have tried to use to kind of address this silence and see it as an invitation into asking different kinds of questions. So in the first part of the talk, we'll be talking about ways of gendering poets in ancient Greece, which ties in with the book that Kate was mentioning, How Women Became Poets. We're then going to run into another area of my work, which is to look at how contemporary women writers like Madeline Miller and Pat Barker, Natalie Haynes, that kind of thing, are looking back to the ancient world and reworking it through the tool of fiction, and how fiction might be a way to respond to silences. And then finally, I'm going to talk about my own efforts in rewriting the women of the ancient world, whether that is through the novels that I've written or through a recent foray into history, which has tried to bring together kind of all of these strands that I'm bringing here, bringing together myth and text, history and archaeology. So that's kind of where we're headed, but we are going to start with gendering poets in ancient Greece. Now, we began with an image of Sappho. She came from this Attic crater attributed to the Brygos painter. And on the crater we have two poets. I've given you now this one on the left. For those of you who know a little bit of Greek, you might see his name across the top. It is Alcaeus. He was a famous lyric poet from the island of Lesbos. And he lived around the turn of the 7th to the 6th centuries BCE. Famous for his beautiful verse, his lyric poetry, and here he is shown holding a lyre. He's got the plectrum hanging down by the side, and the beady-eyed among you will have noticed that he's actually singing. Can you see the ooh coming out of his mouth? So this potter obviously had perhaps a slightly lower opinion of Alcaeus's verse, but yes, he's singing a little ooh there. And next to him we have Sappho. And this is how the vase looks. You can see her name hanging down from her face, Sappho there. You can see her plectrum too is down by the side, but she is not singing in this vase. She is silent. In fact, she is gazing at the male poet who is absorbed in his own poetry. And I see this very much as a metaphor for the way that women poets have been treated in the classical tradition. Sappho is in very many ways the exception. She is, for those of you who haven't heard of her before, the first female poet of the ancient Greek tradition, living at exactly the same time as Alcaeus on exactly the same island, Lesbos, in the Eastern Aegean. And she wrote extraordinary lyric love poetry that really redefined the genre. But here we're seeing her silent and perhaps silenced next to her male compatriot. So what we're going to try and do today is get Sappho to sing again. Now, a little bit of the background to where this idea of thinking about the gendering of the Greek poet came from. I became particularly interested in thinking about the word for poet in ancient Greek. And this is interesting for a couple of different reasons, and we can go into the kind of etymologies of it later. But one of the main reasons is that Greek is a grammatically gendered language. And that might sound like an incidental fact, but if you think about it, every single word that they were using to describe the world around them was something that was constructed and structured by gender. So a table would be gendered, a water jar would be gendered, a chicken would be gendered. And you can see here an example of Aristotle talking about the way that gender delineates the language. And here we've got actually an example that he is giving from a grammarian, Protagoras, where he talks about the need for consistency in grammatical gender. So she, having come, and that's in the feminine, and having conversed in the feminine, went away. So the necessity for grammatical gender to match up to real life. Now, this is kind of interesting because now, as a linguist, we can start diving into language as almost an archaeology of experience, of gendered experience, of a way of reading. The fact that the ancient Greeks were aware of this is made quite clear in a passage up at the top here. This is Aristophanes. He was a very funny comic poet writing in the 5th century BCE. And in his Clouds, which is one of his plays, he has a little skit where he is essentially having one of his characters being taught by Socrates, the famous philosopher of Athens. And he's being taught about names or nouns. In Greek, that is actually the same word, that's onomata. It means name or noun. And he says, you need to know about names, which are male and which ones are female. And he goes through to guide him through the different genders of the language and makes some quite funny jokes in the meantime. Now, Plato, the Greek philosopher, is also interested in names, and he talks about how you need to become an expert in names, how you need to understand where the oldest names come from. So there is a real interest in understanding a history of words and how that ties into gender. This actually has particular applications for what I said about the word for poet. In ancient Greek, the word for poet, it's given up there at the top, is poietes. It's where we get poet from in English. But interestingly, that word poietes actually means maker. That's its kind of etymology. It's a maker man. And this grammarian here is actually using the word poet as an example of grammatical gender. And he says we've got 3 genders. We've got the poet, that's masculine. We've got the poetry, that's feminine. And we've got the poem, that's neuter. Now, what's interesting about that, and this is really where my project started, is that there is no word for the female of poet in Greek. It is a masculine term. This is hugely ironic. The word comes in, I should add, a couple of hundred years after Sappho, but at the beginning, in the period that we are looking at, we don't have a word for poet in the feminine. Now, this is extraordinary because we've got Sappho, who I mentioned as the kind of paradigm of the female poet, who even in the ancient world gets lauded as, they often call her the 10th muse, right? So you've got 9 muses who are the goddesses of song. Sappho is the 10th, so she's really up there. But there was no word to describe a woman who was a poet. Here we've got an example from Plutarch, who is actually talking about how the idea of the poet becomes collapsed and concertinaed into the one poet, the best one, who is preeminently called the poet. Now, Plutarch doesn't even need to say who that is, but that is Homer. Homer, the poet who was attributed in the ancient world to have written the Iliad and the Odyssey. And you can see here how we're starting to get a discourse that is not only saying that to be a poet is to be a man, but to be a poet is also to be in the lineage of great male epic poets like Homer. This is the kind of conversation, this is the kind of world that Sappho is coming into. So let's give you a little bit of an example of the context that Sappho is sort of imploding into. Here we've got a passage from Homer's Odyssey, and we've got a moment where we are actually hearing the word poet in this archaic Greek. So at this point, this word poietes isn't in use. What we've got instead, and I've transliterated it for you there, is singer man, aidoidos ana. And that word singer is being used because Homeric poetry was originally oral. It was sung, it was passed down in performance, handed down over the generations. So here we have a singer man. Now this is a fascinating moment for the gendering of the word poet, because what's happening here is we've got a singer man, an aidoidos ana, who is guarding the wife of the son of Atreus. Anybody know in the audience who the wife of the son of Atreus is? Clytemnestra, exactly. She is Clytemnestra. So when he went to Troy, when Agamemnon went to Troy, he made a singer man guard his wife. You might ask, why? Why did he think a poet was going to be a good guard for Clytemnestra? Turns out it didn't go too well, if anyone knows the end of the story, when Agamemnon came back. But it's a fascinating moment here of not just the gendering of that word, aidoidos ana. He's added in the word for man, interestingly, ana, to like double masculinize it. But it's also a moment of gendered bounding, Because we've got Agamemnon, this male king who's going off to war, who is deeply anxious, quite rightly, about what is going to happen to his wife. And he is using a male bard, the guardian of the male poetic tradition, to guard his wife. It's almost like in guarding his wife and trying to ensure that she doesn't go off track, he is trying to guard his story. So this is a moment where we are seeing an alignment between the masculinity of the bard grammatically, the semantic masculinity, and also that kind of cultural construction of masculinity, where this king is trying to safeguard his story and the way it is going to be told about him. Another fascinating early example of the word poet, and an argument that I hope I'm trying to make for why we should care about the gendering of these words, is this moment. This is from Hesiod, a lesser known poet than Homer in our day, although in antiquity a very important epic poet. And this is, he wrote two epics. We've got the Theogony, which is an amazing kind of Clash of the Titans myth of sort of like the beginnings of the cosmos. And then we've got Works and Days, which is farming advice. I'll leave it to you to decide which one you would like to read. But within this Works and Days, he has this passage where he's essentially trying to create an analogue for power and the power of the superior. And we've got a hawk here who has captured a nightingale in his claws. And the hawk is talking to the nightingale who is trying to sort of cry out. And he says, you know, why are you trying to cry? I am going to basically be in control of this situation, even if you are a singer. Iodon there. Now this is really interesting because here what's happened is that word singer has been forced into the feminine grammatical case. A nightingale in Greek is feminine. In fact, the Greeks thought that only female nightingales sang, which is interesting. So what he's done is he said, like, look, you're trying to be a male bard. You had a go at singing, but I am the stronger one. I'm winning, right? So a really strong discourse here of men having kind of the ownership over the identity of the poet. So what does Sappho do? We've got this first female poet coming in at about 600 BCE. Homer and Hesiod, just to give you a bit of context, date-wise, we're looking at kind of the 8th to the 7th centuries BCE in terms of when these poems are kind of fixating. So Sappho is kind of coming into this scene. How can she talk about herself? How can she understand herself in a language where to be a poet is to be male? Well, we can see here, this is a later poet who is talking about Sappho, and he, at this point, does actually give her that term, poet, ioidos. So I think, yes, I've drawn it out for you here, and that is the moment, the singer who devised the deathless gift of the muses of Helicon. So later poets are saying, right, Sappho can be a singer. What is she going to do about it? We've got this little fragment here. Now, Sappho, I mentioned at the beginning the problem that we are dealing with when we look at women poets. And Sappho is such a great example of that. She wrote 9 books of lyric poetry. And we have a couple of 100 fragments and 1 complete poem from Sappho. The amount that we have lost is extraordinary if you think in comparison to someone like Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, which have full manuscript traditions where we have variants, but we have the entire epics. We've got fragments, and look at this. This is 1 line from Sappho that someone else has quoted. That's the only reason we know that this is here. And she says, superior as the lesbian singer is to those of other lands. And the word she uses here is ioidos, bard or singer. She's using it in the masculine. Now, lesbian here is the adjective from Lesbos, so the island that she comes from, but also Alcaeus, as well as several other famous poets. And what's really interesting about what she's doing in just this short line is that she is creating a generic. The lesbian singer, the singer from Lesbos. Now that's so clever because that could be a male poet, and that's why it fits perfectly into that male poet category. But it can also refer sneakily to her. So it's an amazing moment where you can see a woman trying to work within the boundaries of this language that she has been given to try and refer to herself, even though she's using a masculine term to do it. There's another fragment that, as I was kind of trying to do this work, trying to uncover how Sappho might be talking about herself and how she might be resisting the language that she was working within, that really caught my attention, and it's this one. So again, this is a fragment. This is quoted within another text. This is Maximus of Tyre in his orations, and he's talking about Socrates having an argument with his wife when he was trying to commit suicide. And so, he says, Sappho was angry with her daughter. And this is then, he quotes the Sapphic fragment, "For it is not right that there should be lamentation in the house of those who serve the Muses." Now, what's really interesting about the context that we're given there is that this suggests that actually that house of those who serve the Muses is Sappho's own, that she shares with her daughter. And that, in the Greek, is in fact those who serve the Muses, a single word, musopolos in Greek, attendant of the Muses, or one who serves the Muses. Now, what I find really interesting about that is that one might argue that that is exactly what a poet is doing. The Muses, as I mentioned before, are the female goddesses of song. An attendant of the female goddesses of song, we might say, is a poet. And here we've got a plural noun, it's been turned into a noun, in the feminine, that encapsulates Sappho and her daughter, that creates a new community of female song between a mother and a daughter, of service to the Muses, female goddesses, and sets up an entirely new kind of term that might be circumscribing how Sappho felt about who she was and what she was doing. So this is the kind of example of the ways in which we might kind of read into these tantalizing fragments of poetry and start to try and tease out what these kind of poets, women poets like Sappho, were thinking about and how they were thinking about themselves. I want to give you another example, just to kind of in search of these women poets, just because I think many of you might not have heard her name, and I want you to have heard her name. She is Gnosis, another female poet, one of the very few female poets whose work survives. She is writing much later than Sappho, so remember Sappho was around 600 BCE, we're now looking at about 300 BCE, in a period that we nowadays talk about as the Hellenistic period. She is a conscious Sappho imitator. She loves Sapphic poetry, and so she's kind of looking back to Sappho as her literary foremother. But I particularly love this fragment. And in this fragment, she is pretending to be a man. And she is pretending specifically to be the voice of a male epitaph, a tomb that has been set up for a dead male poet. I mean, that's already a fascinating premise, isn't it, for like a female poet to be taking on. But here it is. This is her kind of fake epitaph. And she says, you know, as you pass by, have a laugh and say hello. My name is Rinthon of Syracuse, and I am a tiny nightingale of the Muses. Now, what's fascinating about that is that this is a woman writing, but she is ventriloquizing a man's voice. She's doing a couple of things. First of all, she's poking fun at him. A tiny little nightingale of the Muses. I mean, that's pretty funny. And that's obviously why she says laughing out loud. She's making a joke. But what's also fun is that that word, tiny little nightingale, is a diminutive of nightingale. Now, if you remember when we were talking earlier about that nightingale in the claws of the hawk, that is a feminine word. What you might have noticed, the eagle-eyed among you, is that it is actually very similar to the word for poet or singer that we saw in Homer, aioidos. Do you remember that? Singer. A nightingale is a singer. That's what it means in Greek, aedon. But it's a female singing bird. Doesn't that make a great word for a female poet? So what she's done is she's basically taken on herself the kind of privilege and what everything that comes with being a male poet, and then she has used it to come up with a word to describe her own poetry, a tiny little female songstress. I really love that as a kind of hidden signature. Okay, let's look at what contemporary women writers are doing. That was a sort of, bullet train through how we might think about women in the ancient world. But one of the things I want to kind of suggest to you is that kind of work that I was doing there, that is very, what we would call philological work, very involved linguistic work, where we're kind of taking apart exactly what Sappho is saying in the Greek, and we're thinking about it. In terms of the recent flux of novels that have flooded the literary market in recent years, reworking the women of Greek myths, they're doing something slightly different. And what they're doing is addressing a different kind of silence, not the fragmentary silence of Sappho, but rather the silences that we see in myth. The women who are marginalized, the women who are silenced, or the women who are hard done by. We can think of many of those. We already talked about Clytemnestra. So we can see that what these novels are doing is trying to take negative or non-existent representations of women and use fiction, use the fact that we can voice these women again as a way to put something into the silence and let these women step forward and tell their stories. Now, it's quite a difficult and different critical work from what I was talking about earlier, but I actually think that these two are very much strings of the same bow. They are about being that kind of flexibility that I was saying about earlier in terms of looking at how we address silences. And I want to give you just a little example of how, particularly focusing on one of them, Margaret Atwood's Penelopiad, we might think about what these novels are doing. Can I have a show of hands in the room, by the way? How many people have read Margaret Atwood's Penelopiad? Oh, we've got a good number. Fantastic. I hope we liked it. Yes, good. I adore this book. It is so good. Let's start off with the problem that Penelope poses, right? I gave you a kind of overview of the kind of things that I think these novels are doing. What is the issue with Penelope in the Odyssey in particular? Well, the issue is we've got here, this is an essay by Carolyn Heilbrunn, talking about the issue of Penelope as being part of a story that has not yet been written. What's happening in Penelope's story is that she is essentially an auxiliary to Odysseus's ending. She needs to do everything that the epic needs her to do in order to maneuver Odysseus into his rightful position as king of Ithaca at the end of the epic. That is what she is doing. What do we do with that? What do we do with a woman who essentially exists as the faithful wife? She's like the opposite of Clytemnestra, right? She's the one who did wait, and that's why Odysseus gets an Odyssey and Agamemnon does not get an Agamemnony. So she did wait. She does it for Odysseus. She gets him his epic. What do we do for Penelope? And Heilbrunn, writing in 1990, says, "We cannot yet make wholly new fictions. We can only transform old tales and recognize how women have transformed old tales in the past. Out of old tales, we must make new lives." I really love this as a kind of rallying cry. And look how long ago this was written. This is anticipating the movement that is happening right now. But I love this as a rallying cry for what it means to look back to the past as a way to write into the present and into the future. And that is absolutely what we see Margaret Atwood doing. Now, when we start off Atwood's Penelopiad, for those of you who haven't read it, it is a retelling of the Odyssey from Penelope's point of view. Penelope is very snarky, she's very self-conscious, and her narration of the tale essentially purports to redress all of the wrongs that have been done to her, both in the Odyssey as well as in the Odyssey's afterlife. So here is Penelope right at the beginning. She's sitting in the underworld in Atwood's imagination, and she says, "Now that all the others have run out of air, it's my turn to do a little story making. I owe it to myself. I've had to work myself up to it. It's a low art tale telling. Old women go in for it, strolling beggars, blind singers, maidservants, children, folks with time on their hands. Once people would have laughed if I tried to play the minstrel. There's nothing more preposterous than an aristocrat fumbling around with the arts. But who cares about public opinion now? The opinion of the people down here, the opinion of shadows, of echoes. So I'll spin a thread of my own." Now, of course, this is very programmatic for Atwood's project. It's also interesting in that she's using that language of spinning a thread of her own when, of course, Penelope is famous for that weaving trick that she managed to delay the suitors with. So here is kind of her program, her desire is to have a go at talking. Penelope, by the way, just to give you a bit of context in terms of her speech in the Odyssey, the first time that she appears in the Odyssey is in the first book of the Odyssey. She comes downstairs because she's heard a bard singing the story of the returns of the Greeks. And Penelope is upset by this, pretty understandably, given that she is trapped in a non-return. Her husband is not coming back. And so she asks the bard to sing a different song. And at that point, her teenage son, Telemachus, who is trying to kind of demonstrate his authority in front of the other suitors, trying to kind of be an Odysseus, stands up and he says, "Go back to your room, get back to the loom and the distaff. Words are for men, and me most of all, for I am the master of this house." And Penelope says nothing, and she turns around and she goes back upstairs. So she is essentially told in the Odyssey that she does not get to speak. Interestingly, the word that Telemachus uses in the Odyssey for words is mythos. It's where we get myth from. So he's not just saying you don't get to speak words, he's saying you don't get access to the words that tell the myths that will be handed down in legends and in epics. And what does the bard do? The bard carries on telling the story of the returns of the Greeks, which of course is the Odyssey. And Penelope is not part of that story. So this is what Atwood is pushing back against. And Penelope now, finally, compared to that act of silencing in the Odyssey, has a moment to have her say. And here she is, very passionately in Atwood. Hadn't I been faithful? Hadn't I waited and waited and waited despite the temptation, almost the compulsion, to do otherwise? And what did I amount to once the official version gained ground? An edifying legend, a stick used to beat other women with. Why couldn't they be as considerate, as trustworthy, as all suffering as I had been? So here she's addressing the fact that Penelope has been held up as this paradigm of the faithful wife. This is something we see throughout ancient literature. Ovid, the Roman poet, famously has Penelope as the faithful wife waiting at home. And she's trying to say, you know, is that really what I wanted? I waited and I don't get my turn at the story. Well, here she is doing a couple of things. We already had her saying that she was faithful, that she waited. Here are a couple of other things that Atwood's Penelope is very keen to address. At the top, we've got the whole question of whether the beggar in disguise is Odysseus. Now, I don't know if you guys have read the Odyssey, maybe you've seen Pasolini's Return, but basically Odysseus comes back halfway through the Odyssey and he gets magicked into a beggar disguise by Athena, and he spends 12 books of the Odyssey, well, 10 books, as disguised as a beggar. In that time, he has multiple conversations with Penelope. She comments on how similar his hands are to Odysseus's. She asks him to interpret a dream where she's got lots of geese that she loves and an eagle kills them all, and Odysseus is like, Odysseus is coming back soon. Now, the question is, does Penelope know that this beggar is Odysseus? I think it's kind of excruciating to imagine that she doesn't, given the number of hints that get dropped. But here, Atwood is like, no, I'm setting the record straight. I knew that he was Odysseus. Right? We've also got the fact that Penelope fortuitously sets up the contest that ends up winning her hand when Odysseus is there. Okay? So, number one, she wants to get rid of the idea that she didn't know who Odysseus was. She knew. Number two, she wants to get into the issue of fidelity. And we've got here, at this point, I feel I must address the various items of slanderous gossip that have been going the rounds for the past 2,000 or 3,000 years. These stories are completely untrue. This is Penelope saying, I was utterly faithful. Now that might be all well and good, except that Atwood does a very Atwood thing, and she alternates Penelope's voice with the voice of 12 enslaved women, or maids as she calls them, who we come across in book 22 of the Odyssey. They get hanged by Odysseus' son Telemachus as part of the brutal slaughter of the suitors. And Atwood wants to give these enslaved women a voice. And so they alternate with Penelope and they have their turn at talking. And here is a moment where they break out into a kind of ditty. And they say, as we approach the climax, grim and gory, let us just say, there is another story, or several, as befits the goddess Rumour, who's sometimes in a good or else bad humour. Word has it that Penelope the prissy was, when it came to sex, no shrinking sissy. They go on to then out her and say that she actually had sex with every single one of the suitors and, in fact, had the goat god Pan from that liaison. So what's fascinating about this is that we had a really good idea of where we were going. We had Penelope's silence in the Odyssey. We had Penelope now is sitting in the underworld, speaking back, saying, I want to have my turn. I knew who Odysseus was. I was completely faithful. And now we have a fragmentation of the truth. Who are we going to believe? What's so interesting and what I love about what Atwood is doing here is that she is prizing apart how we use retellings to kind of get into those really dark crevices of the ancient texts. Right, issues around what Penelope did, but also issues around those hanged women and what happened to them and the justice that they deserve. So we've got this kind of polyphony of female voices opening up this ancient text and making it in many ways kind of a conversation between women where ultimately we don't really know kind of where we stand, but it's making a really interesting intervention. Now, I wanted to turn in the final part to think about the fiction that I have written, as well as kind of my recent foray into kind of archaeology and history, and to try and kind of tie together some of these threads that we've been going through between philology, between modern day fiction, to think about how we might revoice the women of the past. So in 2016, 17 and 18, I wrote a trilogy of novels retelling the stories of the Greek myths. We've got on the left-hand side For the Most Beautiful, which tells the story of the Iliad from the point of view of two enslaved women, Briseis and Chryseis. For the Winner, which tells the story of Atalanta, who, according to one version of the legend, participated in the voyage of Jason and the Argonauts. And then For the Immortal, which tells the story of the amazing and fearsome Amazons. So we'll just dive quickly into rewriting the women of Troy. This is a vase painting of Briseis. You might have come across her if you read Pat Barker's Silence of the Girls, which also kind of narrates Briseis' tale. But she's a captive enslaved woman of Achilles. And what's so interesting about Briseis is that in many ways she starts the Western literary tradition. The Western literary tradition begins with Homer's epic, the Iliad. And the beginning of the Iliad starts with a quarrel between two men, Achilles and Agamemnon, over their enslaved captive women, Briseis and Chryseis. And it is that quarrel, that tension, and what eventually ends up happening is that Agamemnon seizes Achilles' girl Briseis, and Achilles leaves the war in high dudgeon, and that ends up creating all of the tension that becomes the engine of the plot of the Iliad. But it is because of this woman who stands very much at the sidelines. I mean, we were talking about Penelope's silencing in the Odyssey. Just to give you a little bit of context in terms of Briseis, I had a look through. Briseis gets one well-known passage in the Iliad where she speaks. It's a lament for Patroclus in book 19. I've counted the number of lines, and it is about the same as Achilles' magical male talking horse, who starts speaking a couple of lines after Briseis and decides now would be a really good time to start talking. I think that that's really interesting as a kind of index of the amount of airtime that Briseis gets. So to me, that was a really interesting question. You know, the Iliad, we're always told, is the story of the men. It's the story of the war. It's the story of the blood and the gore. But is it not also the story of the women who get captured and who suffer the brunt of the hero's glory? One of the aspects of it that I found really interesting was thinking about the reality of women's lives and how that might intersect with history and archaeology. This is where we're starting to now get closer to kind of where I was signposting towards the end of the talk. This is a spindle whorl. You might not know what it is if you don't take up amateur spinning. Here is a diagram on the right-hand side to help you out. We've got the distaff, which is the kind of tall stick that has the wool, the prepared wool on it. And then we have that wool is being kind of drawn off by the fingers there, and then it comes down onto the spindle, which is flicked round. That's why it's called a spindle, because it spins. And then at the bottom, we've got the spindle whorl, which is a weighted object that keeps the spindle down. Now for us, that's really good news because the spindle whorl is normally made of clay. And so of all of those objects that I've shown you, the distaff, the spindle, those are wood, the wool, that's perishable, all of those biodegrade, but the spindle whorls survive. And this spindle whorl here actually comes from the historical archaeological site of Troy. So this is a real artifact that a woman at the site of Troy once used to spin with. And we get, I don't know if I put the passage on here, no I didn't, we get in the Iliad several moments where we see women spinning and weaving. Most famously we get Helen of Troy, who in her very first instance in the Iliad in book 3, we find weaving a beautiful purple cloth that has the image of the Trojan War on it. So she's very much kind of like the poet. So it's wonderful to imagine that a woman like Homer imagined might have used a spindle wheel like this. Now, in terms of Briseis's reality and her story, as I said, she doesn't get much airtime. The focus is very much on the quarrelling heroes and their glory and their honour. But I did find this, and this is hidden within the catalogue of the ships in Book 2, which, if you've ever come across it, I'm sorry. It's a description of every single ship that went to Troy and where it came from. But we get a moment where we have Achilles sitting on the shore, weeping, and we're told why he's weeping, and it's for Briseis. And we get told that he won her from the city of Lyrnessus. That's one of the satellite cities around Troy. He razed it, he stormed it at the same time as Thebe. That's another satellite city. So the heroes, the Greek heroes, are going round all of the cities around Troy, burning them to the ground, killing the men, stealing the booty, and taking the women captive. Briseis is no exception. Achilles has slaughtered Mynes. We know from the later tradition that that is her husband. And he also slaughters her 3 brothers. So this is a woman whose city has been razed to the ground and who has now been taken captive by the man who did it, who killed her husband and her brothers and is enslaved in the camp. When I started thinking about the Iliad from this way, it made me realize that not only does this ask us to read the Iliad in a completely different way, because the economy of glory that underpins the Iliad is essentially dependent on these women's suffering. But it also allows us to start giving them a moment and a voice that they simply do not get in the Iliad. You can see here, this is an example of, I mentioned Ovid already, this is a moment where he has this rather lovely conceit in one of his collections of poems where he has heroes and heroines writing letters to each other. It's sort of ancient fan fiction. And this is Briseis writing to Achilles, and she's talking about her 3 brothers who he killed. So as I said, to me, this was a way that we could start to not only question the values of the Iliad, but also to allow these women who are so marginalised within that society to speak and to see what the world looks like when we see it from their point of view. What is the cost of war? What is it like to be seen solely as a trophy for men's glory? And that becomes a question not just of revoicing, but also of questioning the project of the Iliad. Now, in my second novel, I started sort of doing something slightly different. Atalanta is a wonderful figure, and she's quite different from, we've been talking about Briseis, who is very silenced, very marginalised. As an enslaved woman, she has very little power. Atalanta is a fascinating kind of exception to this, because she was a woman who extraordinarily pushed the boundaries of what it was to be a woman within Greek myth. We must emphasise that she is legendary, but she's a fantastic legendary story. What happened was, according to the legends, she was born to a king. The king wanted a son, not happy with having a daughter, and so he left her on the mountainside to die. But she got taken up by a bear, raised by the bear. She taught herself to hunt and fight. She became not only a fast runner, but the fastest runner in the world, so faster than all of the men, really good at hunting and fighting. She then took part in the Caledonian boar hunt, which, if it sounds really lame, it was actually a mega boar that was sent by the gods. So this is like a monstrous pig that you have to imagine that's been sent by the gods. And here is an image of her on an archaic vase. I think I've blown it up for you here. Yep, there you can see her. You can see Atalanta there. That is Atalanta. And she, in this hunt that was against a mythical god-sent creature that had a roll call of all of the major heroes of the age, she is the first one to wound the boar amongst all of them. Pretty amazing. Here is a Roman sarcophagus, which I've just included because I rather love both her hunting dog there at her feet and her rather natty hunting boots. But here we have Atalanta firing her arrow, and you can see she's aiming it directly at the boar there. Now, one of the more famous epics of the ancient world, or sort of mythological traditions, was actually earlier than the Trojan War, and it was the voyage of Jason and the Argonauts. And they were said to have sailed all the way from Iolkos in Greece, east towards modern-day Georgia to Colchis. Here's a reconstruction of the boat that the city, modern-day Volos, put together to reconnect to the ancient Jason and the Argonauts. The reason I'm talking about this is because Atalanta has a little bit of a connection. In this, which is the kind of major epic of the story of Jason and the Argonauts, Apollonius's Argonautica, we get the kind of standard idea of kind of a woman on board a ship is unlucky. We've got the Jason who's leading the voyage, doesn't want Atalanta to come because he's afraid everyone is going to fall in love with her. However, when I dug around, I found this other source, a major source of a sort of compendium of Greek myth. And here, this historian Apollodorus has listed Atalanta among the 50 Argonauts who went on this epic voyage with Jason to the east. I thought that was pretty extraordinary to have a woman who was included in this kind of uber masculine voyage where they get into all kinds of stunts and scrapes. Now, what ends up happening to Atalanta at the end of her story in the myth is that she comes back home. Her father agrees to recognise her, but on the condition that she needs to get married. And Atalanta, I think quite understandably, does not want to. She's fiercely independent. And so she makes a condition that she will only marry someone who beats her at a foot race. Now, if you remember, she's the fastest runner in the world, so she knows she's going to win. But what happens is that this guy, Hippomenes, in the rather fetching pink tunic, prays to Aphrodite, the goddess of love, and is given a golden apple. And he rolls it in her path, and she gets distracted, and she bends to pick it up, and he wins the race. And this really bothered me because I've outlined how badass she is in the myth, and the idea that she would set up this competition with the whole idea of it was that she was going to win, and then she would make this kind of mistake. It made it sound like kind of woman gets distracted by glittery golden things, and I was really troubled by that. So what I decided to do in my second novel was essentially to try to ask, imagine if we didn't make that a mistake. What if that wasn't silly woman gets distracted, but instead there was a reason why Atalanta actually did this? And if we started from there, how would her tale look different? Now, the third novel, and I'll just whiz through this one, is thinking about the Amazons. The Amazons are an amazing kind of repository of myth in the ancient world. You can see here, this is Hercules or Heracles in the Greek, fighting with one of the Amazons. One of his labours was to go and get the girdle of Hippolyta. Girdle is how it's normally translated, and that really bugs me because what it actually was a war belt which you would hang axes from, right? So this is no pretty little belt that she's like tying around her waist. This is a big war belt that he is trying to get. But we see the Amazons articulating the axis between West and East, between male and female, between civilized and barbarian across Greek art. Here's a gorgeous example from the Temple of Apollo at Bassae, where you can see the Greek warriors fighting naked because why not? And the Amazons, on the other hand, with one breast exposed. And this is a reference likely to, I'm just going to digress here because it's so interesting, a false etymology for the Amazons. So what seems to have happened is that there is actually evidence for a real civilization of kind of fighting warrior women around the Scythian steppes. So that's around kind of the north of the Black Sea and east towards Georgia. And one of their legendary queens was called Amazon. Her name is handed down in what we call the Nart sagas, so that those are sort of an oral epic tradition. The Greeks heard Amazon, and they thought, well, that sounds like Amazdon. And Amazdon in Greek means no breast. So the Greeks came up with the legend of the idea that the Amazons cut off one of their breasts in order to be able to use a bow and arrow from this false etymology of Amazon. Now, I can certify, because I did archery, that you can do it with two breasts. But you can see this is what iconographically this artist is doing. He's pointing to that etymology of Amazon. Now, I mentioned that we have evidence for these real women warriors, and for me this was a massive impetus for this novel, was to say, okay, the Amazons have occupied male imagination for centuries, if not millennia, but they are horror stories and fantasies in equal measure. They are rolled together as the kind of ultimate opponents that men are meant to vanquish and demonstrate their manhood at the same time as being everything that a woman should not do. But what's wonderful is actually we have a real, tangible, archaeological, historical story here, and that is these warrior graves. I mentioned around the Black Sea as a kind of hotspot for them. Now, these warrior graves were discovered over the course of the 19th century and on. You can tell that they're warrior graves because they are buried with their horses, as well as with weapons. This one you can see with an iron dagger and 2 iron arrowheads. Now, when they were excavated, common archaeological practice was look at the grave goods. If it's a sword, it's a man. If it's got a necklace, it's a woman. And therefore, these were warrior burials, these were male warriors, move on. We've now been able, with what we call aDNA, ancient DNA analysis, to identify the sex of these burials. And in up to 34% of cases, they are female. So this is an extraordinary attestation to women warriors. Oh, the other thing I'll mention, which is fun, is that often when women get buried with swords, the argument will be that they're ceremonial. But what's really fun about these burials, I mean, I say fun, I'm using it loosely, is that they often have arrowheads in their bones. And that suggests that they died in war. You can't really argue against that, unless obviously there was sort of an attack. But you're seeing arrowheads, you're seeing marks from blades. So this is real evidence that we've got women who are fighting just like the Amazons did, and that then kind of rolled into this later tradition. And so when I was looking at sort of rewriting the Amazon myth, I really wanted to think about how we might take these sort of larger-than-life fantasies and we might ground them in a kind of real women's history of warrior queens. Now, this is kind of where we've been going to, which is kind of adding everything up, which is sort of combining that history, those real women, those women poets, as well as the archaeology I've been talking about, the fiction, so that kind of strand of how we might rework women's voices and speak into the silences, as well as the myths, right? Reclaiming that mythos that Telemachus said that Penelope couldn't have, and making sure that women do. So this is my latest book, Penelope's Bones, and in this book I essentially take the women of Homer as my kind of starting point. We've got Penelope, we've got Helen of Troy, we've even got one of the Amazons in there, but I use them only as a kind of way to start, and then our real beginning is with the history, is with the lived experiences of women. Women as weavers, women as mothers. Right? What kinds of burials do we find? What evidence do we find for the votives that women gave? And how does that articulate how we imagine someone like Thetis, who is the mother of Achilles in the Iliad? How do we think about Calypso, who is a nymph who, in the Odyssey, keeps Odysseus captive for 7 years, but actually might have been weaving his sail for him all along? Because a sail took 4 years. Modern estimates suggest a sail would have taken 4 years. So 7 years is not far off. So how does that kind of change how we think? And here are the kind of layers that we're looking at in terms of what I'm kind of trying to bring together, and I think for me what this book was a bit of a culmination of, and kind of what we've gone through today. We've got at the beginning of it kind of the history that we are writing. What kind of history do we think we're writing, and how does the new evidence that is coming in change that? We've got fiction, how we might redress the gaps through the experiences of women, and in order to be able to kind of give them a voice again. We've got myth, can we identify the moments where women are either being maligned or are being silenced, and what can we do to kind of speak back to that? And then finally, we've got, going right back to the beginning of the lecture, we've got the text. What do the ancient texts tell us, and what kinds of tools can we use to deal with the silences in the texts that we have? And to me, I feel like this is a huge invitation to try and bring together all of these very exciting, different aspects of the discipline of classics, oscillating between history and myth and text and fiction, and to be able to uncover the silences of women at last. So I hope that today we've been able to add to Alcaeus, and we've been able to put Sappho back into the picture, and perhaps even pop a little ooh into her as well. Thank you all so much, and you've been a wonderful audience, and I'm delighted to answer questions afterwards. Thank you.
I get to be the spotter. Who has questions?
If everyone wants to just go home, you know, it's fine. It's Monday evening. You've earned it.
Okay, well, I want to be back. So I'm so tantalized to the end, and there's another book that came out recently, and of course, because I'm in front of people, I'm blanking on the title. It was something like Dinner with Tut or something. But it's about experiential archaeology. And the item that you showed of the wheel and so forth, like thinking of, what are your thoughts as someone who primarily does literature about using experiential archaeology and experiments as a method of recreation?
Yeah, absolutely. Did everyone hear the question?
In part.
In part, okay. The question was about experimental archaeology and what I think about experimental archaeology as someone who primarily works with texts. So yes, absolutely. Like, my training is as kind of what we would call like a traditional classicist. So, you know, in the languages, I'm a massive language geek, in case you didn't pick that up. And so for me, the experience with writing my latest book was very much a kind of like, oh wow, like archaeology, that's fantastic, really exciting. So experimental archaeology is particularly interesting because essentially what it means, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is, and it's particularly interesting for weaving, is that you can basically recreate the tools that they were working with, and then you can do the activity, and that will give you really interesting estimates, particularly around, for instance, time. And so, you know, I mentioned very briefly about Calypso and the sail, but the reason that we have this estimate, this is just a paper that came out like 2 years ago, the estimate of how long it would have taken to do a sail, that is because someone has actually rigged up an equivalent late Bronze Age loom, has spun the wool, and then has actually kind of done that weaving to kind of estimate how long that would have taken. So to me, that is revolutionary, because one of the things that it's very easy to do is to discount women's work, or to say, oh, right, women were weaving all the time. Like, what did that actually mean? The reality of that, by the way, is that they've done, again, with experimental archaeology, they have calculated that in order to weave for 1 hour, you would have had to spin thread for 8 hours. So women would have been probably spinning every single hour of the day. In one of the late Bronze Age corpora, in order to get the tribute into the palace that they needed, they have calculated that every single woman in every single household would be working 8 to 10 hours a day on their weaving, just to get their weaving tribute in. So this is something that is serious work. It is something that, I mean, I could go on about this for a long time, because, you know, obviously the spinning, you can move around as you're doing it, you can do childcare as you're doing it. It is something that is done within the frame of the domestic context, so it is very gendered work. But experimental archaeology is key to this, because it is showing us just the sheer amounts of time that I think it took me a while to wrap my head around how much time that really is. Whenever I teach this and I talk about Calypso's sail and my idea that, you know, she might have been just weaving Odysseus's sail and that's why he stayed there so long, she wasn't keeping him captive at all. But I always am like, 4 years, that is an entire undergraduate degree for one sail for one ship. Extraordinary levels. And I think, you know, this ties in also to our kind of modern day dismissal of fabrics and textiles. Textiles were hugely valuable and hugely costly in the ancient world, and women were at the heart of that. Yeah, thanks, Kate.
Any other questions?
You mentioned using text evidence and everything, but I think what I found most interesting was the silence. When you talk about the silence, do you my only experience with stuff like this would be In Cold Blood by Truman Capote, which I didn't really care for. I found it to be too fictional, but do you find the characters like speaking to you in a way, like through the text, in the ways that they work within the bounds of their history?
Okay, so the question was, you know, how do we deal with silence, and do the characters speak through the kind of context that they are presented within? I think it's difficult because as you're asking particularly as a novelist, I assume.
A novelist, but also as someone who is educated in the classics.
Because those are two very different mindsets, right?
Yeah.
Because when I'm doing the kind of academic work, I'm like, okay, what is my methodology? What is my toolkit? How am I approaching this? When I'm a novelist, you're so much freer to say, well, actually, I am going to inject this here. I'm going to interpret this, because as a novelist, your primary concern is that your character has an experience. as an academic, your primary concern is that you are being rigorous in the way that you are dealing with the material that has been given to you. You can't add to the material. You can interpret it in new and interesting ways, but you can't add to it. So I think for me, it was a process of having to oscillate between those two mindsets, but at the same time, always being attentive to what are we trying to do with this silence? How can this silence be productive? And there are, I think, really interesting ways where that has been dealt with Sappho. There is a kind of a dictionary of authors, and the entry for Sappho is a blank page. And I think that's a really interesting statement. If anyone has read Anne Carson's translations of Sappho, if not Winter, Carson is very deliberate about leaving gaps on the page in order to emphasize the fragmentariness. So we can also embrace that. I guess that's also part of what I'm saying. Yeah, thank you. Yes, at the back.
Hello, and thank you for this wonderful talk.
Thank you.
I have two questions, so I'll try to make it say them quickly. So the first part, it was really interesting to hear the work around the terminology of the genders of poetry. And I just wanted to ask that in order to accommodate Sappho, as you said, it's not easy, but on the other hand, it is true that ultimately the model for poetic inspiration is a female one, it's music, and Euripides has to say, Musa Aoidos. So
exactly.
That is well known. But what is interesting is that the muses are not only invoked as they are at the beginning of the Iliad, but they present a model of authority. So in the beginning of Hesiod, as you know, in the Theogony, they say that quite clearly to Hesiod, the poet himself. So I was just wondering how you think that we can also, I not necessarily fill in the gaps, but also pull the threads from the muses, right? With the poets appropriating that space, and then sort of creating also the space for the female poetic voice, such as it is in antiquity, and its reception in the press.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you. So if you didn't hear the question was about the role of the muses in ancient literature, and particularly the fact that in Hesiod's Theogony, which is the interesting one, that's where he has a conversation with the muses on Mount Helicon, and the muses have a little chat with him. So yes, I absolutely, and I actually talk about this in the book. My way of thinking about it is that there is a real paradox, and I think it is one that articulates the relationship between male poets and women, and I think we see that across the muses, but also across female figures, within Homer and Hesiod and beyond. And that is that women have a powerful relationship to poetry. You see that with the muses. You see that when Homer in Book 2 of the Iliad says, you know, I wouldn't be able to do this without you. The thing is, do the muses actually sing? No. Whose voice are we hearing? We are hearing the male poet's voice. In fact, in Hesiod, it's even more pernicious because he is actually ventriloquizing the muses, because he is saying them in his own voice. So it is, the way I read it, and there are other readings. There are readings where scholars, particularly Penelope Murray, will see the muses as kind of positive demonstrations of women's kind of abstractions as poetry. I see it as kind of much more pernicious, where actually I think that men are recognizing that women have a powerful creative force, and they are then saying, we are making this our own. In fact, they are using it to legitimize their poetry. But I think that could be argued back and forth. But thank you so much for the question. Yeah, the muses are really important.
Let me ask you, since the Penelopiad was quite a bit earlier,
Yep.
as was Theater with Persephone that somebody mentioned that is not as well known, and the recent publication of books such as Miller, etc., and of course including your own, what do you think the moment today has to say about the proliferation of books on the reception of women in classical texts?
Yeah, thank you. So the run-up to that was that Atwood was published in 2005, the Penelopiad. So what's different now, essentially? What's happening now? I mean, that is such a long question, and it's one I've thought a lot about. It's one I've written about as well. I think there are a lot of different things happening. I think the main one to me is Me Too. And the reason I say that is because, first of all, if you have a look across the novels, addressing sexual violence is a really key concern of a lot of them. And obviously sexual violence is at the heart of many Greek myths and Greek myths' relationship to gender. But also, Me Too is a movement of collective voicing. And this is a very collective movement of Greek myth retellings. And that collectivity, the power in multiple women telling what might look like the same story, but is different because it's a different experience, that actually patterns very well onto what was happening with Me Too. And so I think that there is a public understanding of the power of that kind of narrative that has now enabled us to see, not like, oh, this is another retelling, but no, this is another retelling. It's telling the same story in a different way. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, thank you. I am aware that we're over time. Are we okay? I mean, I'd love to take more questions.
So we do have to, so we're going to have a book signing after this, and I think what I'm going to do is have a brief break. If the last two people want to come speak for a few minutes while we get things sorted for the signing, and everyone else can go buy books if they haven't already. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. And I would definitely very much like to thank Emily for this amazing talk and for visiting us.
Thank you.